say a few ideas on Pirkei Avot, the second chapter, the second Mishnah. In the first Mishnah, we had the father, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the editor, the redactor of the Mishnah, who talked about what I called 4 levels of a person's relationship to the mitzvot and the ethical life. In this particular Mishnah, Raban Gamliel is talking about what I call the 3-part model, which is also very popular in Mishnaic thinking, especially Midrashic thinking, of the relationship between Torah and Derech Eretz. But as the Maharal points out, the discussion here is about Talmud Torah. Not Torah in general, but the study of Torah. The relationship of the study of Torah with Derech Eretz. What is Derech Eretz? Literally it means the way of nature, the way of the world. It seems that now Derech Eretz is understood, at least in this context, as a livelihood. Derech Eretz would be a livelihood. Yafat Torah im Derech Eretz. And it's obvious from this Mishnah that Derech Eretz means a livelihood. For instance, he says, Yafet Talmud Torah im Derech Eretz. It's very good to study Torah with Derech Eretz. And then what's the reason? Sheyegiat shnehem mashkach adavon. Because both of these Yigi'ah is toiling or laboring in both of these areas keeps a person away from sin. So it makes sense if you study Torah on the one hand because you're involved in the world of Torah, and also if you Torah labor, it keeps you busy. So things that keep you busy keep you away from transgression. So it's obvious here that Derech Eretz means labor, probably physical labor. There's the Talmud says in another place that even a woman who is wealthy, it's not good for her not to do anything, because it says habatala, meaning not working, mevile de shiamum, brings to idleness and to boredom. Vishiamum mevile de chet, and boredom brings to sin. So people have to be busy in this world. It is unnatural not to have anything to do. And not to have something to do is not something which is natural for the human being. And I'm not talking about vacation time. Vacation time is a relationship towards the other times when I am busy. So here it's obviously Derech Eretz means parnasa, a livelihood, some type of labor that a person does for their livelihood. Later on, we have this concept, and maybe not just later on. Sometimes Derech Eretz means being ethical, being an ethical person. And this is the way very often it's used in modern Hebrew, Derech Eretz. When you say that somebody has no Derech Eretz, we mean that they have no ethical sensitivity. They have no common sense, sometimes we mean, about these things. There is a bitui, there's an expression where you say Derech Eretz Kadmala Torah, which means knowing how to be a good human being came before the Torah. Because Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Leah, Rachel, Sarah, they all came before the giving of the Torah, but they knew the ethical way, the moral road. So that's called Derech Eretz Kadmala Torah. There's actually a midrash like that, but it states it in a slightly different way. The midrash in Breshit Rabbah on the verse Derech Eitz HaChaim says on the way to the tree of life. So the midrash says, why does it say Derech Eitz HaChaim? It says Derech Zu Derech Eretz. The word Derech is talking about Derech Eretz, being a moral person. Eitz HaChaim, that's talking about Torah. So there are two things. First, a person has to learn how to be moral. Then they have to learn Torah, because Torah is a second level. But in this and by the way, so as I said, Derech Eretz is normally a livelihood, or Derech Eretz means to be a moral human being. In the 19th century, so Samson Raphael Hirsch coined the term Tov Torah im Derech Eretz, which of course seems to relate to this Mishnah, but actually does not. says it's good to study Torah together with Derech Eretz, and there he meant secular knowledge. Now you could say secular knowledge is needed for a livelihood, but he just meant in general secular knowledge and Torah. But that's a 19th century understanding, and this understanding continued until this day in the halls of Yeshiva University in the United States. Now, getting back to Rabbi Gamliel. So, Yafet Talmud Torah im Derech Eretz, which means it's good to study Torah and also be involved in Parnassah, in a livelihood, because both of them will keep a person from sin. Okay, it's a good thing. But look at the second part. V'kol Torah she'eini mamlacha. And if you study Torah without having a livelihood, sofa b'teila, this Torah will be nullified. V'goreret avon, it's going to bring you to iniquity and sin. Whoa. First you said it's a good thing. It keeps you away from sin. Now you're saying if you don't do that, you're going to fall into sin. This is a much stronger statement than the first one. Basically, he's saying you must have a livelihood. Here, just to show you how the Kahati translates this. Sofa b'teila, the Torah, Sofa b'teila, he doesn't say the Torah will be annulled, but the person himself or herself will not study Torah anymore, because, as it says in Pirkei Avot, he named Kemach in Torah. If there's no flour, there's no Torah, which means human beings have to have money to keep themselves surviving. V'goreret avon, because when a person becomes that poor, they will do anything to get money. And then it makes them cross lines and cut corners. So this is he has like a positive and a negative. But actually he's saying the same thing, just in a more extreme way. First he says it's good to be busy. I think most people would agree with that, whether it's study of Torah or a livelihood. But then he says it's impossible to study Torah without a livelihood, because it's going to bring you eventually to sin. I guess if you were independently wealthy, you might not. There was once a lecturer at Hebrew University in Jewish philosophy who was from an independently wealthy background, so he taught for free, but that's unusual. But you have people like that too, people who want to study Torah, they marry into a wealthy family. In the 18th, 19th century, it was not unusual that a wealthy person might look for a son-in-law who was a Torah scholar in order for the name within the family. That could happen too. But that's the exception. It's not, So, in general, what he's saying, you have to have some connection between Torah and a livelihood. And then he says, because if not, it's going to bring you to sin. Now, in a book which I just recently published on Chaim Volozhin, there's an interesting discussion there based on the manuscripts that I bring about his understanding of livelihood. In general, Chaim Volozhin, the founder, the famous student of the Vilna Gaon, and the founder of the Lozhin Yeshiva, had two understandings of this. There's the regular people, who for them, it says in Pirkei Avot, or it says actually also the Talmud brings a braita that you have to designate times for Torah study. You have to be kovea itim de Torah. You have to designate times for Torah study. So Chaim Volozhin says this is referring to somebody, the average person, who most of their time is their livelihood, so they have to set time for Torah study. However, if you're talking about a yeshiva scholar who is already spending their time what we call Torato Umanuto, then they have to do the obvious, which is the opposite, which is set time for when they're going to do things for their livelihood. Because as Rabbi Gamliel said, it's not possible just to study Torah without a livelihood. Remember, they didn't have a concept of a kollel in those days. Nobody got money for studying Torah. So obviously you have to do something. Now, if you're very creative and you can spend 2 hours a day doing something else and that's enough for you, so he says 2 hours a day. Some of the manuscripts say 3 hours a day, some say 4 hours a day. Obviously, if it's more than 4 hours a day, you're not Torah Umanuto anymore. You're not spending most of your time on Torah anymore. But of course, the goal is that even when you're spending your time on Torah, to do minimal amount in order to help your livelihood, so that you can continue spending the majority of your time on Torah study. But obviously, not everybody is able to do that. In the time of Chaim Volozhin, it was usually young people who did that, and everybody else, of course, would look for some type of occupation as a teacher or as a rabbi, as a scholar in a community, whatever was possible at the time. Now I'm continuing. Kol ha'meilim matzibur, and anybody who spends their time laboring for the community. Now I guess we're referring here first and foremost to functionaries. Those who are in charge of the tzedakah of the community, those who are in charge of the poor, those who are in charge of the burial society, those who are in charge of the synagogue and the various functions of the community. Kol ha'meilim matzibur, people who are working with the community, yu'amilim mehem l'shem shamayim. They should realize that they have to do it for the sake of heaven. Shezchut avotam asayatam v'tzidkatam omeret la'ad. Now, this is an interesting thing also to understand it. I'll read you what Kahati says. He says, first of all, obviously you have to do this l'shem mitzvah. And to realize that even if you're getting a salary, you're doing it for the community. And not in order to glorify yourself, or in order to benefit, or to hold power over the rest of the community. Because zchut avotam asayatam, the way he translates it is the zchut of the tzibur, the merit of the community. This will help you be successful, and this will bring your success. It wasn't you; it was them. When you do things for the community, the merit of the community will make you successful. So don't think you're that talented. V'tzidkatam omeret la'ad, which means again the merits of their ancestors will make you matzliach, will make you successful. So don't act as if you're such a big shot. It's not about you. You are the functionary. And then it finishes off, Atem, Maleani lechem shachar beikilo asitem, and you will be judged as if you actually did. So the question is, what do you mean, as if you actually did? Did what? We're still talking about, of course, these functionaries of the community. So he explains. Okay, that's one thing. But the first interpretation is still very interesting. Because everything you do, its success is based on the merit of the community, it's as if you didn't really do it, but don't worry, min hashamayim, your reward will be as if you did it. Even though, don't think it was mostly because of you. It was mostly because of the community. Hen el kabir b'lo yimas. God always listens to the needs of the many. So the merit of the community is really helping you be matzliach, being successful. But don't worry, when it comes to the reward in Yenervelt, in the time to come, God will give you the reward as if it was because of you. But that's not the way you should present it to the community. You have to be a little bit more humble and understand that there is the merit of the Rabim, of the Klal, of the collective. So that's interpretation number one. I think that's actually a very important interpretation. The next one is, which means functionaries of communities can be overwhelmed sometimes. And sometimes you're so overwhelmed that you don't have time to do other mitzvot, which you would like to do in your life. Therefore, Rabbi Gamliel says, don't worry. God understands that the fact that it's taking up your time is for a good purpose, just like a person who studies Torah, sometimes it's for a good purpose, and therefore, don't worry, it'll be as if you kept the mitzvot that you wanted to do and didn't have the time to do because you were involved in other mitzvot. Okay, I'm going to leave it at those two. Now, I just want to point out one other thing, and that's the structure of this Mishnah. What is the structure of this Mishnah? The structure of this Mishnah, in my opinion, follows the structure of a Mishnah already in chapter 1. If you remember in chapter 1, right at the beginning, you had Shimon HaTzadik, literally right at the beginning, in the second Mishnah of chapter 1. And the second Mishnah of chapter 1 says that Shimon HaTzadik says, the world stands on three things: Torah, which means the study of Torah; Avodah, which means, in this case, Avodat HaMikdash, the service of the temple, working in the temple; and Gamliel Chasadim, which is basically charity, altruism, doing kindness. Yes. In chapter 2, Mishnah 2, there's a reinterpretation of these three elements upon which the world is standing. And it's not a reinterpretation, actually, because it's not about the world. It's about what I would call the relationship between Torah and day-to-day needs of the daily life. And this creates also a triple element, which is also Torah, Avodah, and Gamliel Chasadim, but a little bit different. Again, let's talk about the study of Torah. The study of Torah cannot, in other words, Raban Gamliel is taking these three issues, but he's applying it to what I call the practicalities and sometimes the vicissitudes of life. The study of Torah needs at least minimal derech eretz, at least minimal striving for a livelihood, or else it's going to push you in directions which the Torah is not trying to teach you. That's number one. So the study of Torah with derech eretz. What about avodah? In other words, the study of Torah needs this balance. Now, the second thing, avodah, the truth is, Torah needs avodah, needs the livelihood. Because if you don't have any livelihood, you'll be able to study Torah, and you won't be able to live a life of Torah, because poverty will push you to necessity, and necessity will push you to sin. So, in a sense, livelihood has a good, sometimes Torah without livelihood will not keep you away from sin. Livelihood will keep you away from sin, and Torah will keep you towards Kedusha. You need both. You cannot have only one. So the first one was talking about Torah in general. That's why it doesn't talk about the negative. It just says it's good to realize you're going to also need, and it just calls it derech eretz here. Where derech eretz, you can still interpret it many, many ways, keeping yourself busy with something else. Maybe in that sense, even though most people understand derech eretz here as malacha, but he actually doesn't use the term malacha until the second statement, which is interesting. But basically he's saying that Torah and even something else, if it wasn't a livelihood, both of them keep you busy, your mind busy. Not everybody's able to study Torah 100%. But the second part is saying that even though other things can also keep you away from sin, let's say if you went to university together with Torah, even though they didn't have that concept in those days, but you specifically need a livelihood with Torah. Even if you have other things to occupy your mind with, it's not enough, because you need that parnasah to keep you away from poverty, to keep you away from something which is going to push you towards sin. So that's the Torah, the Avodah, and what's the Gamliel Chasadim? Those who are the functionaries of the community are also doing Gamliel Chasadim. They are doing altruistic kindness to the community, even if it's a function. Some of these people might even be doing it volunteer, but most of them, even as functionaries, it is an act of Gamliel Chasadim. And a person should realize this, that their success is because of the merit of the tzibur, of the community, and not necessarily themselves. So they should not pride themselves. That destroys the... You can get a salary and still be doing a mitzvah. But if you use this position to gain power, to be arrogant, to show how great you are, then it's not as much of a mitzvah anymore. So keep away from those things. And then even so, as a functionary, and even if this is your salary, you can see it as a mitzvah. I remember one time I had a Shabbat program I was doing in Tzfat. And there was a fellow who wanted to be the tour guide to take us around. So we negotiated with him before, and his price was a little bit high. So then he said, okay, you know what? I'm willing to do as a mitzvah, but if I do a mitzvah, you're not allowed to pay me anything. So I was thinking, I don't get it. All we want is a regular price. It's still a mitzvah. In his thinking, if you give him 1 penny, it's not a mitzvah anymore. It's not true. It's not true. We're not talking about salaries with 6-digit salaries. If somebody gets money for their time, it doesn't mean it's not a mitzvah. If you're teaching Torah and they're paying you schar bitul because in that time you could have done other things to make your livelihood, it doesn't mean it's not a mitzvah. But if you start making yourself arrogant and look for power, or you turn it into a money machine, then this is already mitigating the situation. But because there's an imbalance between a mitzvah and a transgression happening simultaneously here. So I just want to point that out, that even though I don't think Rabban Gamliel is trying to reinterpret the saying of Shimon of Tzaddik, Torah, Avot, Gemilut, Chasadim, but he's just taking that same 3 elements and putting it into a different context of this interface between Torah, doing mitzvot, and daily life. Now, one last thing I want to mention is that, of course, Rabban Gamliel, who is the head of the Sanhedrin, is the son of Yehuda Hanasi, as pointed out in the Mishnah itself. And right after this, in Mishnah Gimel, it's also continuation of things that he used to say, of Rabban Gamliel, and also in Mishnah Daled. But by Mishnah Hey, it jumps to Hillel. We'll talk about that more more next week. Why, after 3 Mishnayot of Rabban Gamliel, the son of Yehuda Nasi, it goes back 100 years to Hillel and starts bringing things in his name. In the meantime, I wish everybody happy Lag BaOmer, which is coming up in a few days. Shalom, shalom.